Welcome everybody to this SSEESing Now event, making sense of the new Ukraine-Russia crisis. My name's Ben Noble, an Associate Professor of Russian Politics at UCL SSEES, and I'll be chairing this session. The purpose of SSEESing Now events is to discuss current developing issues in the SSEES region to help members of the media, policy and academic communities, as well as the general public, understand what's going on. We do this by bringing together an expert panel to present their thoughts before opening up to questions from the audience. The ongoing confrontation between Western governments and Russia centering on Ukraine has emerged as one of the most pressing security challenges of the moment, making it an ideal topic for the SSEESing Now series. And this is particularly so since commentary and analysis around the issue has been markedly varied. Some voices have predicted imminent moves by Russian forces, but claims like this have been made for such a sustained period now that the very definition of the word imminent has been debated. Other voices have framed the current crisis as simple posturing by an attention-hungry Vladimir Putin. Others still see in recent developments an attempt by Russia's leadership to force a new vision of European security on Western governments. So who's right? Is Russia's very strategy to keep us guessing? This panel brings together a distinguished group of experts to help make sense of what's going on, how we've got to where we are, and what might happen next. Oksana Antonenko is a director at Control Risks with particular expertise on Russia, Turkey, Central and Eastern Europe, Central Asia, European institutions, and international financial institutions. Professor Mark Galeotti is an honorary professor at UCL SSEES and has recently published a book with Yale University Press called The Weaponization of Everything, a field guide to the new way of war. Orysia Lutsevych is a research fellow and manager of the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House and is author of the very influential report, How to Finish a Revolution, Civil Society and Democracy in Georgia, Moldova and Ukraine. And last but not least, Professor Andrew Wilson is Professor of Ukrainian Studies at UCL SSEES and author of many books on Ukraine, including Ukraine Crisis, What It Means for the West, published by Yale University Press. This event is being run as a Zoom webinar and is being recorded with the video to be posted on the SSEES YouTube channel in the coming days. The four panelists will each have 10 minutes to make some initial points, after which we'll turn to questions from the audience. You can put a question to the panelists at any time by writing it in the Zoom Q&A box, the button for which should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. When we get to the Q&A portion of the event after the initial panelist comments, I'll select questions and may combine similar proposals. The panelists are going to tackle a range of questions in their opening remarks, including what's driving the current escalation on the Russian side? How has the West done so far in diffusing the crisis? What is and is not militarily feasible? And what is Kiev's strategy? We've clearly got lots to talk about before the event ends at 6:30. So without further ado, let me hand over to our first panelist, Oksana.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you for the invitation, and really my pleasure to join this excellent panel. And since we all are still guessing, as Ben quite rightly pointed out, I'm very much looking forward to hearing both from other panelists and also from the audience. Let me offer a few thoughts from my side of where we are at the moment, how the West has so far managed this crisis, what is likely happening on the Russian side, and finally, perhaps what the outlook is in my view. Let me start by basically maybe summarizing of where we are and how we got here. And I think the basic facts are also quite important, I think, to establish. And for me, the most important fact is that this escalation has not started in November or December last year. It really started at the beginning of last year. And you remember that the first reports about the buildup of Russian forces really appeared very quickly, after President Biden has assumed his presidency. And you remember very well that this buildup of Russian forces was diffused, or at least one can say rewarded, by the summit between President Biden and President Putin quite early on in Biden's presidency, something which was not really expected or anticipated before. We also remember that at that summit in Geneva between Biden and Putin, the key strategy which was adopted by the American side at that time is to draw very clearly what the red lines are for the United States in relationship with Russia and try to establish this open and frank dialogue around the red lines. which is a very different strategy than what the American administrations has really pursued in relations to Russia, be it the Obama administration, which tried to establish some sort of partnership and cooperation, at least early on in the presidency, or the Trump administration, which pretty much had this chaotic dialogue with Russia, but supplemented by sanctions. But I think by emphasizing the red lines and by rewarding this kind of buildup of forces, I think we have really put ourselves on the path which brought us, I believe, to where we are at the moment at the crisis. I think the key lesson which President Putin has learned from what happened last year is that he can really gamble by pretty low cost strategy of applying pressure on Ukraine. I think we know that, of course, Russia has established very substantial military presence in the western part of Russia, close to the Ukrainian border for some time. So on a permanent basis, Russia has been deploying around 70,000 troops. So the difference really between 70 or 77,000 and 100,000 is not a very substantial one. So it is very easy to bring that to that level. Also that Russia should be very clearly providing its views on what the Russia's red line is in this relationship. And I think that is what President Putin at the moment is doing. He is using the same strategy by identifying in the quite crude and I would say probably undiplomatic, one could say, manner, what the Russia's red lines are. I think a lot of times, in the West, people are saying that Putin is playing chess, that he is a strategist, he's trying to get us all guessing, he has something up his sleeve. But I think what he's really playing here is a judo. And he is very good at, playing judo, which is primarily, focused around identifying and exploiting very quickly the weaknesses on the other side. And what the Kremlin at the moment believes, and I think that is very, very clearly articulated numerously in Putin's speeches, and something which we hear oftentimes from Russian, experts and even from the Russian television, that the view is that the West is very weak, that the Biden administration, despite of the Biden's credentials in foreign policy, has so far did not really cover itself in glory, particularly in Afghanistan, but even beyond that, of projecting real strength of American policy in the international arena. That the Biden administration is keen to shift attention to the East, the relationship with China, and that the Europeans at the moment are divided. They are perhaps too absorbed after COVID with their internal differences, and it is perhaps the opportune moment for Putin to really try to step up the stakes in this, geopolitical game and try to demand what for a long time he saw from his point of view as a red line. So let me now say a few words, what the West has done so far and how effective it was. I certainly think that it is very important and very positive that we have seen, despite of the pressure that we've seen from Russia and buildup of forces, particularly I would say recently, the buildup of Russian forces in Belarus, which really presents an additional substantial military escalation on the ground, that the West has held its nerve, that there has not been any compromise at all, despite of various suggestions that have been flying around of agreeing either a moratorium of Ukraine's NATO membership or even taking it off the agenda altogether. We've seen more or less unity between Europe and the United States. And thirdly, that we have really seen kind of an engagement with Russia, but in a very coordinated fashion. That I think is all positive. Where I think things are less positive, is the fact that, United States, I think unreasonably, have overblown this kind of imminency and the severity of threat that Russia posed. Clearly, Russia was not, and still probably not to this time, is in a position to launch a kind of full-on invasion of Ukraine that oftentimes, is being mentioned by various policymakers, not least in this country. By kind of applying this megaphone diplomacy, perhaps the United States and the West more broadly has given President Putin more opportunities to achieve quite a lot from this, crisis. And I would argue that he certainly has already quite a lot in his on his side that he has achieved. I think the big question for me, whether it is enough for him to declare victory or whether he still hopes to squeeze more. And I will say a little bit more later on what I think he has already achieved. The second point to mention is to what extent the threat of sanctions, and that was the main strategy on which the West so far relied for deterrence, has been sufficient to really stop and prevent further escalation of what I call maximum pressure on Ukraine, which Russia is currently applying. in my view, the sanctions has not proven itself to be an effective instrument. And there are several reasons for that. Of course, we all know that Russia has been living under sanctions for some time now. And that it has not only managed to kind of sanction-proof to a large extent its economy, but I think the credibility of sanctions as an effective instrument to change policy has not been proven so far. And I think for Putin, sanctions have delivered quite a lot of positive things, like rallying around the flag, like allowing him to translate this kind of threat to Ukraine to the tension between Russia and NATO rather than Ukraine. And thirdly, I think the credibility, particularly of the European sanctions in Russia, now as the gas prices are so high, as we've seen the gas reserves in parts of Europe now, or gas storage has fallen to the record low facility, levels that have not really seen before. So the capacity of the Europeans to really apply severe economic sanctions in the energy sector, in the financial sector in Russia are really very much in doubt. And we've seen quite a lot of divisions in Europe. So sanctions is a key policy instrument to deter whatever Russia is doing, in my view, is not working so well. So what actually did work? What I think worked at the moment is that President Putin has so far, as I said, secured quite a lot of concessions from the West. And he secured it not by rolling the tank armies through the plains, but actually without firing a shot, by just playing along this game, very 21st century virtual war, primarily of information rather than of military warfare. What has he secured? I think we've seen, of course, him now being welcomed not only to sit at the table, something which we used to be calling no business as usual in relations with Russia. I think now the offering from the West, from both NATO and United States, is well beyond business as usual. We've seen, the dialogue restarting in many areas, with Russia. Russia is now setting up pretty much the agenda for the European security discussion, something which we have not really seen for many, many years. One can argue ever since the ill-fated Medvedev's proposal on the European Security Treaty. And there is as we've seen yesterday from the kind of leaked papers, which were published by Al-Qais, the offer is not only to sustain these negotiations, but to expand them both in the framework of the Russian NATO Council, OSCE, and other forums. The United States has offered very substantial security benefits to Putin, starting from offering to put on the table legally binding discussions about the non-deployment of intermediate and short-range missiles, some sort of inspections and transparency over the Aegis ashore in Romania and Poland, something which Russia was demanding for many years but never found any response. And of course, there's also a discussion still about non-deployment of weapons in Ukraine, something which of course will require Russia to be more involved in discussions about Ukrainian security. So I think as a package, Putin has done so quite well from the current escalation. But as I said, the big question at the table now, is it enough for him to declare victory after the military exercises, or are we still in a situation where the escalation is still possible? And I will leave it to other panelists to really offer their views on that. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you for that, Oksana. Over to you now, Mark.
Super, thanks very much. And I should apologize to everyone, I'm afraid, because of another commitment, I have to drop out halfway through this, so I should just disappear mysteriously at a point. Well, I mean, Oksana has given a really very sort of powerful and effective tour d'horizon. So really, I want to drill down on a few specific issues. And the first one is the obvious one, which is also the one that none of us can actually answer, but all of us have opinions on, which is, what does Putin want? If anyone tells you they know what Putin wants, they're lying. I don't even believe that Putin is absolutely certain of, you might say, the detail of what he wants in terms of the final outcome. And that's, I think, a crucial point. Because if we look at this, I mean, it's interesting that when one looks at the initial Russian ask, it was ridiculously overambitious. And I suspect knowingly so. I mean, it's just that they're basically in a haggling situation. So, of course, you start very high because you know you're going to be brought down. But nonetheless, it had both a Ukraine piece and a European security architecture piece. And I think that's crucial. This is about Ukraine. This is about European security architecture more broadly. And the two are not just simply two sort of individual elements. They are, I think, from the Kremlin's point of view, interconnected. When Putin talks about the fear about Western missiles being based near Kharkiv and such like, on one level, it sounds like, and it is, a paranoid fantasy. But it's not entirely a paranoid fantasy, and more to the point, it doesn't really matter if it is or is not, in the sense of I think it is a genuinely held view. From the people, particularly Putin and the more hawkish types around him, there is a belief that NATO is not just simply a defensive alliance, that NATO cannot be trusted, hence the emphasis on wanting pieces of paper and signed declarations rather than any understandings or whatever. They feel that NATO has broken those in the past. And again, look, I mean, I'm not trying to present the Russian point of view. I just think we have to be aware of where it is. And therefore, this is why they're particularly concerned about Ukraine. There are all kinds of weird and toxic misunderstandings about the nature of Ukraine as a country, Ukrainians as people, and so forth, that we see coming out from the Kremlin, from Putin, and more recently from Medvedev, which again, I mean, they are probably accurate in representing the confused notions of these people, but we don't really have to go much beyond it. So there is a sense that Ukraine isn't a real state. The Ukrainians are not a real people. And therefore, they don't really have the right to break free of Russia's sphere of influence. Because again, Putin is a very 19th century geopolitician who thinks that this is how a great power demonstrates its greatness, is amongst other things by having a sphere of influence of countries that are not totally run by them. This is not a man who wants to recreate the Tsarist empire, but nonetheless, whose sovereignty is subordinated to the interests of the metropolis. They have only partial sovereignty. But what really makes that crucial is this notion that even if Ukraine was not part of NATO, it could still have Western forces, bases, and generally security architecture upon it. And that he would regard as an unacceptable security risk. And why? Precisely because of, as far as he's concerned, the NATO problem. The fact that NATO is actually an anti-Russian alliance, antagonistic, hostile, committed to undermining and constraining Russia, denying it its rightful place in the world. So this is, I think, one of the crucial challenges we face is precisely this cannot be resolved purely in terms of addressing the Ukraine side of it, nor is it something that can be purely resolved, I would say, by looking at the European security architecture. It is all mulched together. But of course, the key thing is we don't know what ultimately the balance between Putin's willingness to take risks and what he actually feels will be the minimum acceptable deal that will allow him to feel that he has achieved something and achieved much. It's quite interesting, after all, we've recently had the 30th anniversary of the downfall of the USSR. And if one looks at how Putin talks about that, I mean, it's clear that as far as he's concerned, Gorbachev was weak. And it's that weakness that brought down an empire. And he's clearly determined that of all the historical parallels he plays with Peter the Great, Stolypin, and so forth, Gorbachev, definitely not one of them. So, we're also dealing with a psychological issue. Putin thinking about his historical legacy, thinking about his political position, what can he sell? I mean, he has huge freedom of maneuver in the sense of he doesn't have to worry about his legislature. He has the media essentially state controlled and so forth. He can spin a lot of things, but nonetheless, he will be feeling that he needs to have something that is at least that he can present as being commensurate with the outcome. So we'll just have to see. And this is actually one of the virtues of the continuing discussion. I mean, I've always thought it was problematic, this idea that dialogue was something that we withheld as a punishment, because we actually need to talk all the more continually with the people with whom we disagree. And part of the process of the dialogue will be trying to get some sense of where the Russians actually will land. Because it doesn't necessarily mean giving them that much stuff that they're not entitled to, or that actually doesn't make mutual sense. Often it will be identifying those things which can at least be spun and presented as victories. And yes, we might end up having to, in a way, collaborate with Putin in terms of his spin and take concessions that don't really mean very much, but wrap them up in shiny wrapping paper and put a nice bow on them so that he can present them as such. As far as I'm concerned, so be it. Because, well, what has he got at his disposal? I mean, he has this massive military force, which is, unlike previous military buildups, genuinely ready and prepared for war. I mean, one of the things that distinguishes it from that is that it's not just teeth, guns and tanks, it's tail, all the logistical backup, the field hospitals, the fuel bowsers, the ammunition stores, which means that it really is genuinely deployable. And this is a force, well, what can it do? Given that the Russians also can rely on extensive long-range air power and missile attacks, basically this is a force that could defeat the Ukrainian army on the battlefield. But we should stress one key point. That is not the same as pacification. That is not the same as being able to occupy and control, especially if we start talking about cities. That is a whole order of magnitude greater of a task. And this is, again, one of the reasons why then there is this debate about actually, is a Russian attack plausible? It's because actually a lot of the sort of the more fanciful scenarios involve taking cities. Now, how has Russia taken cities in the past? Well, if you ask the good citizens of Grozny or Aleppo, it's basically by bombing the hell out of it. I'm not quite so convinced that that would be viable or politically acceptable in Dnipro or Kharkiv or whatever. So actually, in that respect, the Russians would not be able to operate. They'd have to go in for the nasty detail work of street fighting, which is, if nothing else, exceedingly carnivorous. There will be a lot of Russians coming home in zinc boxes as a result. And there's absolutely no evidence that the Russian population has any enthusiasm for that. So, I mean, this is our problem analytically. He's built up an expensive and force that is genuinely ready to roll. And in a way, part of the debate is precisely from the military analysts, capability equals intent. If they've done this, it's because they're planning on using it. On the other hand, it's easy to also give all kinds of good reasons why he wouldn't want to do it. What we don't know, after all, is what Putin is being told. This is one of the key imponderables. Is he being told by yes men and sycophants that actually the Ukrainian people are waiting and eager for the removal of a, I don't know, neo-fascist, incompetent, corrupt government or whatever? Or is he being actually told that the realities of the situation? That we don't know. I am, if I had to sort of guess one way, more optimistic than not, that there are people who are giving him some sense of the realities on the ground, but we don't know. So let me conclude. Where do I think we're going to go? Well, it's incredibly risky to try and make predictions, but I'm here. So I'm still, I mean, I think that the military escalation of some kind, 30% likelihood, that's still roughly my guess. I think it's more likely that it won't be. But on the other hand, what we're now beginning to see coming out of the debate in Moscow itself, often this is kind of intra-elite debates that sort of bubble out eventually into the media and Telegram channels and things, is what you might say, sub-invasion, try to say, options like recognizing the pseudo-states of the Donbass and Luhansk People's Republics. On one level, this would be actually a major policy defeat for Moscow. But the point is, it could be dressed up as an act of heroic decision, that they have decided to move in and regardless of everything else, they are going to protect the people, the Russian-speaking, and in many ways Russian passport-holding people of these regions, because it's clear that Kiev doesn't want to deal. It would mean giving up on the hope of Minsk and in terms of being able to create a long-term influence on Ukrainian politics. It would mean continuing to have to pay for these pseudo-states, these kind of gangster-ridden warlords states. But nonetheless, it is something that is there as a potential off-ramp. Or they could just keep this going indefinitely. And after a certain point, it normalizes the situation and all these American claims of imminence begin to sound rather ridiculous. Putin has options. And I think that's the key point I'd end with. This is a man who has built a situation where he has multiple options. And even if he thinks he knows which he's going to take today, he could change his mind tomorrow. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Mark. Orysia, over to you.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks for inviting me. It's very interesting to hear my colleagues, and I think both Oksana and Mark given you kind of what we know and the known knowns. Now there are unknowns, and all those things we may be guessing, but I think we should stay away as much as possible from that exercise because it may get even more confused. There's already such a torrent of information and the kind of red flags that people are watching depending on where you are in security or more in foreign policy. So we're all watching for different shifting pieces of the puzzle. But I think one thing to add to what Oksana and Mark said, and I think it's different from like even spring of last year. Mark pointed to more readiness, you know, the detail part of it, but also there's Black Sea, and we see quite substantial build up in the Black Sea. We've seen a cyber attack on Ukraine that was quite, overwhelming because it disabled a major governmental website that was issued COVID certificates, but also very kind of threatening messages that target individuals, interestingly, right? Threatening revenge to Ukrainian citizens as if this revenge actually is coming from Poland. So this whole cyber attack was quite serious, and we still don't know full consequences of that. It's being investigated. And also there's Belarus. There was Zapad, of course, last year, but it seems like Lukashenko is not what it was, year and a half ago. Clearly, Russia is turning Belarus to a similar degree what it has done with Crimea in this military base. And also it's now poking more NATO around. It's not enough just to poke Ukraine these days, right? You need to create pressure around NATO fringes. So we see activity in Belarus. We'll see more activity in the Black Sea. We were seeing around Sweden and kind of Ireland. So I think this is different. And I believe there's a clear confidence that Russian military activity can compel the collective West, if you want, and especially United States to reconsider its posture in its presence in Europe overall, but especially its role and support to countries like Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, you name it. I think it's not just about Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine is this prime geopolitical prey, I would say, but I think it goes beyond, it's more regional. So, and I think partially, in Russia, because of what, of the Soviet legacy, NATO has a certain image, and it's an easy wave to ride of this threatening alliance. But clearly Russia has an overwhelming conventional military superiority in Europe because the NATO member states were cutting their armed forces. It's really, honestly, no way of even comparable scale to Russia if you're talking conventional. And I think the real threat to Russian Federation and to Kremlin leadership is honestly not being at the table with superpowers, by putting tanks on Ukraine's border. Russian brought also taburetka, so to speak, a little chair next to the big table where they see US and China sitting as the vision. And I think also it's a certain degree fear of the succession, what will happen. Mark talked about the Putin's legacy. I think by creating some supranational conglomerate of states in his sphere of influence, he may be thinking that it's how he can reincarnate post-president of Russian Federation. And honestly, I think it's also a certain degree of fear of disintegration of Russia or threat of centrifugal forces within Russia. It's almost as a feeling, if you don't expand, you shrink. And that's why Putin was saying we have no place to retreat, which I found it quite bizarre, and trying to understand what he said, he has no space to retreat. But I think there's that enshrined anxiety about the strength of Russian Federation itself in the midterm. But Kiev's strategy is to manage this crisis and to survive and persevere is basically driven by very clear long-term objectives. And these objectives are obviously to safely reintegrate Donbass, and I emphasize safely, not reintegrate at any cost on any terms, to start negotiating the settlement of Crimea. It's to achieve some kind of security umbrella within, I think, either collective security alliance or building, as we see now increasingly, regional alliances with the coalition of the willing, countries that are able to boost Ukraine's own capacity to rely on its own defense and to protect sovereignty of Ukraine. Of course, its strategic interest in EU membership remains, and we do see since 2014 the complete turnaround of Ukraine's economy towards European and global markets, stay away from Russian energy that are directly being pumped into Ukraine. And this change is transformative. It came as a big shock to an economy and businesses, but I think Ukraine went through a relatively good adaptation process to that, with visa facilitation, with business standards, and more export going to EU. This is the past. There's no turning away from that. And finally, Ukrainian elite has to satisfy a very strong craving for change. And that craving for change is impossible right now, the way Ukraine sees, without all these things I've mentioned. It's simply, you see, Kyiv sees no other way out of this arrested development rather than the pathway I've described. So obviously in the kind of last months and throughout, I mean, I would even say throughout 8 years since the annexation of Crimea, Kyiv was trying to do diplomacy, deterrence, and determination. Of course, with deterrence, it was very difficult because none of the Western partners were really willing to build Ukraine's own capacity to defend. It was very low assistance, a little bit of training, so nothing really that was Kyiv always asked for. We do know that Obama and Merkel were no-go on any arms supply to Ukraine, but right now the situation changed, and we see quite substantial military assistance that will rise the cost to any military aggression. It is clear that that is a factor, especially with UK assistance, of course, US assistance, Polish assistance, the Netherlands, the Czech assistance. You have quite a lot of countries bilaterally helping Ukraine. Economic component is very important because all those tanks on Ukraine's borders are basically crashing Ukrainian economy. Ukrainian sovereign debt is almost junk bonds. Ukraine understands that if economy is destabilized, it's another win for Putin because then you have possibility of internal turbulence. And here the West responded also resolutely with EU's microfinancial assistance, UK assistance. IMF says more assistance will be available to countries if there is disturbance coming from further aggression. And finally, I think there was also on this deterrence quite strong communication of willingness to defend Ukraine. And we've seen a lot of articles, statements, a lot of reporting, public opinion polling exactly on that question. But regardless of what the West does, Ukrainians will defend their right for the future, because this is what it is fundamentally, whether Ukraine has the future or it's stuck in some kind of no man's land, gray zone, buffer zone, chopped into dysfunctional pieces, made into some kind of a Bosnia of Eastern Europe. And that perseverance and determination that Kyiv demonstrates with actually appointment also of the new Minister of Defense that is much more capable. It comes, for example, through approaching security as a total defense a concept. It's not new, but you call it whole of society approach, something that is actually applied in Finland, for example, other non-NATO member states, where you don't just rely on the security is not just the responsibility of state agencies, armed forces and security services, but private sector and citizens as such. So this resolve, we have more than 24%, for example, Ukrainians saying we are ready to defend, and these are not armed forces, just citizens. Across all age groups, they say we're ready to defend with arms, and a lot of them already sign up to territorial defense units. 30% say they will volunteer to support families or whatever is needed, or armed forces. Only around 30% say we're not going to participate in this. We don't want to be part of it. So there's quite a lot of that societal preparation. Just to wrap up, to say a few words on Donbass and something that Mark was mentioning. I think Russia came into the stalemate, in the impasse, what to do with Donbass, because it started the uprising there with the desire to undermine Kyiv. It's not about some territorial call, right? That Russia doesn't need it. Now, if Russia recognizes Donbass as independent state and officially Russian Duma approves supplying weapons, it's in a way takes away that leverage, and it would clarify much more the situation, who is the occupying power in the region, something that Ukraine recognized Russia as the occupying authority in Donbass. And if any settlement alongside of changing of the constitution with a special status will be enforced by a military incursion, which is possible, right? Putin's done it before. This will actually backfire because at this point, society is not ready to accept this compromise. And this actually could be one of Putin's strategy, to use Normandy format, to use to insist on constitutional change, and in this way to destabilize Ukraine and then possibly move also from other directions to create chaos, because I think he believes where there's chaos, there's opportunity, and then using different options he has on his table. So it will be, I agree, a long-term conflict that will evolve over next year, honestly. So we should be prepared to watch how it evolves, and it will shape everything, both Russia, Ukraine, and Europe for the times to come. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you for that, Orysia. And finally, on to Andy. Andy.
Thanks, Ben. Hello, everybody. Once I found out that I was going to speak last, victim of my surname, there was always a danger that what I was going to say would be said by others first. So I would be mainly talking about German philosophy. Bear with me. It's my way of answering Ben's opening question. Is this existential threat to Ukraine, or is it bluff or propaganda, or is it Russia's attempt to reshape European security order? My answer is, via German philosophy, that it's all three. Firstly, because of method. This is what Russians would call kombinatsiya. Push on all fronts at once. Then you wait to see how the kaleidoscope shifts the pattern, and then you decide where to push further. So Russia, as Mark was saying, or Putin, has a general plan, but he doesn't himself exactly know what he's going to do next. It depends where he can gain most advantage. Now, the Russians love reading Clausewitz, Sun Tzu, who would perhaps say that it's not a good idea to pressure all your enemies at once. But Russia thinks most of its enemies are weak. It also has the advantage of acting geopolitically when most other people are not thinking or even acting, even less acting geopolitically. There's no risk, there's not so much risk of others making geopolitical moves against Russia, of Japan stabbing it in the back, opening a second front. You know, that's not going to happen. So Russia can benefit from strategic geopolitical asymmetry. Secondly, this is an intellectual story. And I recommend a book by David Lewis called Russia's New Authoritarianism, which came out last month. So this is my take on him. It's about Carl Schmitt's influence on Russian domestic and foreign policy. On foreign policy, Schmitt talked about the Großraum, the big space. The Russians tend to talk about civilizations. Each civilization has a hegemon within it, which Russians obviously think is Russia within the post-Soviet world. Hegemons have full sovereignty. If they have what Vladislav Surkov called konkurentnosposobnost, right, that they're powerful, then they have ability to compete, they deserve said sovereignty. The hegemons are equal to one another, but they're superior to the other states in their Großraum, or big space. Those limited sovereignty states only have technical sovereignty. The hegemon decides their foreign policy and who their friend enemy is, their security policy in general. The hegemon acts to police their Großraum. Hegemon keeps out what Schmidt called Raumfremde Mächte, which means powers who are alien to the space, those who might interfere from other civilization. So the hegemon organizes the whole big space. The limited sovereignty states lack true subjectivity. They lack the historical and political basis for full sovereignty. Only the hegemon has that. The hegemon provides a unifying idea for the Großraum or civilization. Hopefully this long excursion into Carl Schmitt's philosophy helps to explain what Russia wants now, which is hegemon to hegemon dialogue with America, a concert of hegemons or powers, sphere of influence, a Yalta II. Ukraine is one of the limited sovereignty states. If you read Putin's history essay, and I recommend everybody that you should, on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, its whole narrative is Schmittian. So Putin says the Ukrainian idea is artificial. It's created by these outside third parties, the Raumfremde Mächte. The Ukrainian idea isn't a Schmittian idea or even a Hegelian one. It's not, quote, the bearer of a state idea, still less an imperial idea. A very telling quote from another geopolitical Russian expert, Alexander Dugin. The Russian idea is a big idea. Right? He even puts big idea in capital letters, Velikaya idea. Right? The Ukrainian idea is a small idea. So it's not something you can just dismiss. It's something that's existentially dangerous to Russia, and it would be control of its Großraum, its big space. But it's also because, sotto voce, the Ukrainian idea is actually a state idea. It overlaps with and undercuts the Russian idea on its own terms. So for Putin, or for Putin's Russia and Ukraine, it's not just about this or that territory, it's about the very existence of Ukraine. And thirdly, if Russia ideally wants a Yalta II, some kind of European security compact, before that, it wants us to buy into their geopolitics, their virtual reality, to discuss things in their terms, to accept that we may be at fault for the expansion of NATO and primarily some other things, to admit that we are these Raumfremde Mächte, these foreign powers in Ukraine's part of the world, to accept that Ukraine and others are only these limited sovereignty states, to admit that the Ukrainian idea is either invented or just small. And we confirm that every time the Ukrainians are not in the room. Right? That America has conceded this hegemon to hegemon dialogue, hence the Ukrainian slogan, Ničeho pro Ukrajinu bez Ukrajiny, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. But of course, we're doing that all the time at the moment. Maybe there's a case for doing this, as Mark was saying. Who cares? Give the Russians what they want, dress it up with a nice bow, talk to them in these terms, and that saves lives. But then, and the matrix is out again, so we can put it in matrix terms. You're trapped in their alternative reality, in their matrix, and it would be very hard to get out. Our view of the world is, of course, very different. All states are equally sovereign. There are no hegemons, and Ukraine is a subject in its own right. So what does Russia want? It wants a lot. It wants everything. And it wants reflexive control. It wants to define what Ukraine is able to do and not to do. And it even wants to affect the way we talk about the world and Russia's foreign policy place within it. That's a big agenda, but if we're clearer about what actually Russia does want, we can avoid conceding too much where unnecessary. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for that, Andy, and thanks to all the panelists, including Mark, who has had to move on to his other event. As you'll see from the Q&A box, we have plenty of questions. Unfortunately, we will not be able to get through all of these questions. So what I'm going to suggest is that on the event page, there will be a hyperlink that provides more information about the panelists. And I'm hoping that if their contact details are available on those pages, which I imagine they will be, that if you have a pressing question, then please do feel free to contact them if we're not able to get through your question in this Q&A session. We have around 40 minutes for Q&A. So looking at the questions that have already been asked, I'm going to ask them in groups of 3. And I'm not at the outset going to pick particular panelists to answer them, but if you all stay silent, then I might prod one of you into answering them. So the first question is the first question that is asked in the Q&A box. That's by Andy Dembitsky. What is the Belarusian role here in respect to the Union state? And he notes that Russian troops have been building up in the country since 2014. Is it just the goal of Russia to annex Belarus and get as much out of the West as possible? So how does Belarus fit into all of this? And I might prod Andy into answering that question if he doesn't volunteer. The second question is the second question posed, and that's by Robin Dixon. Robin says, we saw Alexei Danilov from the Ukraine Security Council warning that if foreign powers press Ukraine to implement the Minsk agreement, it could lead to chaos and destabilize Ukraine. Does Danilov have a point? Could this play into Russia's desire to undermine Zelensky, or is Minsk unchanged the best hope for an off-ramp? And there are other questions relating to the Minsk agreement, but I'm choosing Robin's as it was the second question asked. And then the third question is the third question posed. That's from Khalifa Al-Kuwari, and that is, do you think that the current media frenzy around the imminent, and that's in quotation marks, Russian invasion is an exaggeration when considering Russia's inability to bear the economic costs of a full-scale invasion? And there are other questions relating to the credibility of the Russian threat, given either economic conditions currently in Russia or possible economic conditions and how they might worsen, given possible sanctions if an invasion were to take place. So they're the 3 questions we're starting with. Belarus, the Minsk agreement, and the likelihood of an imminent invasion given economic costs. So let's begin with the first. And Andy, if there aren't any other takers, if you could kick us off, thanks.
Yeah, very happy to talk about Belarus. With Belarus, obviously, we have to start in August 2020. The 3 months of protests against the rigged election that Lukashenko survived, but with Russian help. So he's very much beholden to Russia since then. But if you count the number of times that Lukashenko and Putin have met since August 2020, I don't know, a dozen times or more, they have spent a long time negotiating the price that Lukashenko has to pay. He's very reluctant to move in 2 other areas. One, selling the crown jewels of the economy to the Russians. 2, and he needs to keep hold of the levers of power domestically in order to stay in power. So that's my interpretation of why he has given more in actual security terms to Putin in the last few months, because he hasn't moved so much on the other things. There is no cost, no downside to him in survival terms from facilitating a very aggressive line against Ukraine. And that's at least 2 things. One, the presence of Russian troops on Belarus, which secondly stretches Ukraine's strategic thinking. It has to think about defending itself on, well, at least 2 fronts, possibly 4, given Transnistria and military build-up in Crimea and the Black Sea as well. But also rhetorically, he's doing the kind of things that Zhirinovsky used to do for Putin, say the unsayable. If you look at his New Year message, he said, this will be the year of unions, Russia, Ukraine, and even Kazakhstan. We will get Ukraine back, quote unquote. I don't think he means Belarus will. He means the collective Slavic we, East Slavic we. This is strategically really bad news for Ukraine, obviously, from something of a partner in the 2014-2020 period. Belarus is now Ukraine's partner. Belarus is now aiding and abetting Russian intimidation.
Thanks, Andy. Orysia, might you take the Minsk agreement? Thanks.
So I think Minsk is a perfect illustration to that what Andrew described as the way to institutionalize limited sovereignty. And then there's, it's important to remember Geneva meeting for those who are following the outbreak of takeover of administrative buildings in Donbass. There was a meeting between John Kerry, Cathy Ashton, and Ukraine and Russian, I think it was Lavrov was there. And that Geneva protocol was transparently clear what should happen first. Deoccupy administrative buildings, disarm military formations, illegal military formations, demilitarize and move on to discuss some kind of decentralized governments, which, you know, in a way is what Ukraine did while Russia occupied Donbass. Ukraine decentralized dramatically. Public finance is decentralized. You know, communities are governing themselves by elected councils. All of this is happening. I mean, this would have been a dream for Donbass, right? But this is not what was in mind. And then this Geneva protocol was basically, US was kicked out. Somebody whispered something in Normandy celebration, and Russians felt like having Germany and France is much more convenient, you know, negotiators than United States. Then they escalated around the Baltsevo and Ilovaisk, and you have them using heavy metal diplomacy to coerce Ukraine into these agreements. I think it's very important to say that inside Ukraine, and I'm looking at the public opinion poll, people who would support, you know, the future of DNR and LNR, these regions, with to have autonomy as part of Ukraine. And I'm looking even at the east of Ukraine, it's 20%, in the south of Ukraine, 26%. There's nowhere a majority for this idea. Of course, in the center is only 11%. So I think that, and over time, Kiev kind of managed to explain the time bomb that is in the Minsk agreements to France and Germany. And that's why Russian media basically published confidential exchange of letters between the parties, which basically showed that they have no confidence in Minsk themselves, unless we come back to the drawing table and do it the Kremlin way. Again, we will have to watch whether, if there is a military invasion, this will change the calculus, the political calculus of the elite, of the public opinion of the population. You know, it can be a very fluid situation. Honestly, Zelensky has a constitutional number of votes inside the parliament together with the opposition bloc to pass these constitutional changes, and Putin knows it. It legally can be done under his watch, but he will be, in a way, it will be his suicide inside Ukraine if he does it. And I don't see how Minsk can be a way out of it. And I agree with what Danilov said in Robin's question. Yeah.
Thanks, Oksana.
Thanks. I mean, if I can maybe quickly react a little bit to what Andy said, I was really impressed by his presentation. You know, sounded very interesting. But you know, but if we go away from the theory and German philosophy and go to, you know, unfortunate reality we're in today, with all of that, you know, highly respected, you know, strategy that the West had towards the former Soviet Union, emphasizing independence and sovereignty of countries. What actually happened over the last year, I think, you know, puts a lot of question marks to what extent, you know, that declarations actually had a major impact on what happened there. You know, first we've seen, you know, Belarus, exactly as you mentioned before. You know, any attempts to, you know, support from the West to support the protests, you know, actually failed, and Putin has secured now, you know, almost, you know, in unbalanced, you know, uncontested control and pressure over Lukashenko, which he's planning to exploit. Then we had conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, to which neither Europeans nor Americans lended any assistance to what was going on. In fact, we had a kind of a real war in Europe on the European periphery with tank armies and artillery, and there was zero input from the West. Everyone was just staying behind. Putin was able to assert himself and introduce the peacekeepers. Most recently, we had this crisis in Kazakhstan. Again, we've seen that all the great positions that the West is taking about the sovereignty and the rest of it, we have seen exactly zero input from anyone from either Europe or United States at the time when the crisis was happening. And Russia sent forces and has managed to make yet another government along its periphery dependent on it for providing kind of political backing. So we are pretty much now across the entire periphery of Russia, with the exception of Ukraine and Georgia. And in Georgia, we all know the situation is politically, in a way, going backwards in many ways, right, in terms of reforms. And so in that sense, even though the West is in this kind of high moral ground supporting sovereignty, but unfortunately the rules of the game in that part of the world, have really empowered Putin to believe, rightly or wrongly, that he is able to use his methods and strategies and prevail with almost no challenge or pushback from the West. And I think that's why he feels emboldened to do what he does in Ukraine. Now, the question about the cost, I mentioned already in my remarks that I personally don't believe that the sanctions and the threat of sanctions is an effective deterrence if he really wants to do something. At the same time, I do agree with others who said at the panel that from my point of view, the likelihood of invasion, certainly big invasion, is very low. I think less than 5%, but some sort of military incident perhaps is going to take place or could take place. But again, I don't think this is a plan A for Putin. I think he's hoping that by mounting this extreme pressure campaign, which has so far costed him nothing, he's able to exert quite a lot of concessions from the West, because it is not a very opportune moment from the Biden administration to see, another major war in Europe, to which, he is going to stand at the sidelines. And I think it was already clear from Washington and from NATO that there will not be direct assistance to Ukraine should Russia do anything on Ukraine's territory. It's certainly not assistance, military assistance. And Europe is in the midst of, what there was in one of the questions from the audience about the energy crisis. Yes, the energy crisis is very substantial. Of course, we all know that Gazprom has played an absolutely critical role in driving the gas prices to where they are at the moment, because not only that Gazprom has pulled out or removed some of its gas from the storage facilities in Europe in August, thus driving prices high already at the start of the season, but it refused to book any additional volumes at the time when the prices are very high, and they could have sold a lot of gas, not only through Ukraine, but also through Yamal pipeline now for more than a month. So in a sense, Europeans are now facing the situation that any further disruption of Russian gas supplies with, storage in Europe at a record low, and we still have 2 months of winter, is potentially could be economically extremely costly and politically problematic for Europe. So in that sense, Putin with his, strategies is actually seems to be playing it to the extent, this kind of extreme pressure, which is not really resulted in any price. Whether he can afford a military invasion, clearly that question mark how this invasion is going to go. Can he afford a prolonged military invasion of the kind that Mark was talking about? Of course not. But it is very unlikely that this is what they're planning. What I think they're planning is to destabilize the Ukrainian regime from that, the Ukrainian government from the outside, by what Russia sees as a kind of economic pressure, and at the same time also to negotiate and pressure the West for concessions. And I don't think that is an issue of the cost.
Sorry, Ben, may I just 2 fingers
Please do.
to say,
Yeah.
Because I think, there's a question on Belarus, and it's very important. I think I agree with Oksana that Putin will try for as long as possible to keep ambiguity. He is not involved. It's Ukrainian civil war. He has issues with NATO, not with anything else, right? The Donbass, Kyiv should talk to the DNR, LNR. But Belarus here is critical because, I think that he may use this as the way to, we've already seen statements by Lukashenko that Ukrainian drones are encroaching on Belarusian airspace. It could be the place where this exactly kind of red flag provocation operation takes place. I'm saying just to watch this northern direction of Belarus, because the Belarus borders with Kyiv Oblast. It's really close to the capital. It's one of the closest positions if you look at the map. You know, all kinds of scenarios from, you know, Russian troops being dressed in Belarusian army. We can imagine Putin's plan to keep this ambiguity and deniability of his own involvement as such, and use proxies like he uses proxies in Donbass, like he used proxies in Crimea, because this is what destabilizes the West, because it's blurred, it's not clear what is happening. Then we need to convene another discussion. And notice also the change of the constitution inside Belarus. Possibly this will allow Putin even, you know, to station some nuclear weapons there. And that is the targeting NATO, that is targeting Western capitals. That is why I think this confrontation happens, Russia-Ukraine and Russia-NATO, Russia-US. And these are two tracks that are happening at the same time. This is how I see it. So I think it's important to watch what's happening up north.
I mean, of course,
Sana, did you want to come in?
just a very quick one. I mean, I think if we think about whether Putin really wants to take control over yet more territory within Ukraine, I mean, it seems to me the worst kind of highest risk, lowest reward strategy, you know, because at the moment, of course, you know, he can, exactly as you say, the deniability, but you know, adding additional, you know, region, which is going to be at this time, Ukrainian army, exactly as you said, will definitely fight. You know, there's more capabilities there, including in the north. It will be costly, and it will create even more support for Ukraine, of course, from NATO, more military support, and potentially some sanctions in Russia. So in a sense, I don't think the idea of kind of, you know, carving out yet another region is something that Putin is after. I think he's after either, you know, subjugating Ukraine through this maximum pressure campaign, you know, potentially with military means, but most importantly, I think exerting concessions from the West through this prolonged, very kind of costly and you know, costly in terms of political, you know, occupied political will from the West at the moment. So, you know, look at this country in Europe and the United States, they're spending too much time talking about this Russian military buildup while they have other things on their agenda, and hoping that he's going to actually get from them a commitment either about the moratorium of a NATO membership for Ukraine or other demands that he put forward. And he has time on his hands because he has no pressure domestically at the moment. You know, and he managed to convince the population. As you can see, 75% of Russians believe that it's NATO that is responsible for this escalation, not Russia, even though this is just simply not true, of course.
Thanks both. So next on to the second round of questions, three of them. The first, a question from John Newham, and that relates to Russia's security concerns and whether the panelists think there are any legitimate grounds on which Russia should have concerns of its own. The second question relates to that a bit, and this is a question from Camille Dussard saying, do you believe there has been an increased understanding of Russia's perspectives and narratives on NATO from the West, and could that possibly enhance and strengthen dialogue? And then the third question, very similar questions pitched by Marie Degenfeld and Asha Shodje, is what's Germany's role in all of this? So I'm going to let the panelists decide who answers which of those three, or if they want to have a stab.
Well, I can say a few words about the legitimate concerns. I mean, I think we need to define what the parameters are for legitimate concerns. Of course, every country has to define or can define its own security concerns and can, you know, announce them, you know, or you know, present them to the world. The question is to what extent, you know, those concerns, you know, could be the reason to then encroach on the sovereignty of neighboring countries. And that is certainly not legitimate under any international law, or in fact, any of the founding documents of the European security, be it the Paris Charter, be it the NATO-Russia Founding Act, be it, you know, any other documents that Russia itself has signed. But of course, the fact that Russia feels insecure about NATO enlargement is something which we simply cannot just say, well, so be it, right? Of course, there needs to be some way to mitigate those insecurities. And so far from NATO, there were, 3 different strategies on this. Early on in 1990s and early 2000, the approach was simply that, well, Russia doesn't get it. NATO enlargement is good for Russia. So we simply just have to repeat it as many times as we can that it's good for Russia and Russia will believe it. Of course, that didn't work because Putin still, from his Munich speech, says that, he sees it as a threat. Then there was, second strategy of let's discuss through the Russian NATO Council and develop the kind of mechanism, be it, conventional arms control, CFE treaty, the confidence building measures, transparency, Vienna document, we need to, observe exercises, let's, do, in prevention of incidents frameworks. But unfortunately, all of those mechanisms and frameworks have now been demolished, and a lot of it, because Russia itself demolished them or refused to implement them. For example, on the transparency of military exercises, Russia deliberately doesn't provide transparency information about the exercises it should provide, be it in Belarus or when it exercises near Ukrainian borders. So now the third, strategy at the moment is that, Russia believes that NATO enlargement is a threat, but, let's, build or strengthen these partnerships, with partners so that we can have an inclusive dialogue, but again, that is not working. So we need to find a way in this current situation to talk to Russia about NATO enlargement. I totally agree in that sense with what was said before, that dialogue should not be seen as a concession. Dialogue is important, but I think we should not, in this situation, consider that Russia's concern about NATO enlargement should be seen as a legitimate mechanism to limit the choices and sovereignty of countries like Ukraine. So that is not the case. And I think the mechanism which is proposed by the United States at the moment, be it within the Russian NATO Council or OSCE, where some of those concerns of Russia, very specific ones, for example, about the deployment of specific missiles on the territory of Poland and Romania, where Russia believes that those missile defense elements, which the United States says is directed against Iran, is in fact directed against Russia. So Russia continues to tell that this is a real threat, imminent threat to Russia. Well, if we have a mechanism of transparency, the United States paper said very clearly, yes, the United States is open to make those sites transparent, to show that the Tomahawk missiles are not based there, that it's just, as the United States says, missile infrastructure, which is not directed against Russia. But for that, Russia on a reciprocal basis has to also open its own sites in Kaliningrad, potentially in Crimea, in other places where NATO also has concerns about what is Russia deploying there, including in the area of the tactical nuclear weapons. So it has to be a reciprocal process. Let's start a dialogue, but that of course should be done in a situation where we don't have a gun to people's head, that Russia has to de-escalate first. So that could be a way to mitigate Russia's concerns.
And thanks, Oksana. Who's going to take on the question about NATO and understanding Russia, if that's improved?
I'll talk about Germany. So, Orysia.
I also wanted to talk about Germany, but it's okay. You talk about Germany. I mean, I think honestly, as I said at the beginning, I think that these a bit smokescreen security concerns that are being presented for the public, specifically about NATO, and then there are, I mean, it's interesting to discuss what are the real threats to Russia, right? Not the way they are formulated by the Kremlin elite right now, because there is very much fusion about preserving power and operating out of that paradigm, right? Rather than what is good for Russian national interest. And I think it was the Economist issue this week that said that you have a clear divergence of interest between the ruling elite and what's in the national interest of Russia. And I think that because of the media environment in Russia, the way it is controlled, manipulated by the Kremlin and its spin doctors, it's very difficult to break through that wall And I think we are not seeing much change, and Oksana gave the public opinion polls inside Russia. This is, if there is a military escalation, it will be not presented as it's the war against Ukraine. It will be presented as the war against NATO, destroying NATO infrastructure, as Putin calls it, destroying these new capabilities that were provided by allies, UK, US, Canada, from the air, most likely, the easiest way to do it. So I think that Russia, that kind of civilizational ideological thinking that Andrew described, needs fortress Russia, needs the opponent, and NATO perfectly fits that role of that opponent. And that's why they nurture it and sustain it, the way I see it.
Andy, Germany.
Well, when the new coalition took office, there were hopes, actually unfulfilled, that the Green part of the coalition would steer German foreign policy in a post-Merkel direction, a bit more realistic, a bit tougher about Russia, a bit more balance between Russia and the neighborhood. But at the moment, it seems to be SPD, recidivist Ostpolitik, that is predominant. The sending of helmets to Ukraine was divided Ukrainian opinion. Some people thought it was offensive, some people thought it was a joke. Right? Nobody thought it was seriously helpful. Germany didn't allow the UK arms delivery to fly over its territory. Germany has not given approval to Estonia to send East German origin howitzers to Ukraine. So Germany is seen as doing almost zero for Ukraine, at least in Kiev. The UK, on the other hand, I hate to say, talk about the benefits of Brexit, but maybe in this particular case, there is some. If we'd still been in the EU, we'd have been locked in long negotiation with Paris and Berlin, but we have been able to act unilaterally in a way which suits our military strengths. Whereas back to Germany, it's doubly passive, I think, in that Macron is making all the running within the Normandy format. He, of course, has an election in April, and that's clearly what's driving his activism. The French press is full of Macron saves Europe stuff. So Germany has been very, very disappointing.
Orysia, did you want to say some points about Germany?
Just a few points, and I think there's that historical legacy in the Socialist Party is about comparing Ostpolitik, applying Ostpolitik of the late Soviet period to current Russia. And I think there's real split in Olaf Scholz's party, and there's a risk even of split within the party if he takes a stronger stance on Russia, which reminds a little bit predicament of Tories with Brexit, and how they gambled into a very negative outcome for the UK. So there's I see the certain parallels, but important to say that late Soviet Union, especially the 70s and 80s, when they wanted to have more compromise, they never used gas as weapons, and they needed hard currency to buy grain, because till the end of Soviet Union, they didn't have enough grain to feed the people. And that's why they were constructive and cooperative. Cash for grain and sell gas. It was a clear relationship. I don't think there's any clarity of such relationship at the moment. And that's why we see a much riskier revisionist Russia. So that Ostpolitik is just simply irrelevant.
Thanks, Orysia. We have just over 10 minutes left, so I'm going to suggest we try and tackle two more questions. The first relates to the Russian domestic context and how much that can explain what's going on now and the timing of it. So there are similar questions from Anya Korol and Thomas Hazel. I'm going to read out Thomas's question. That is, to what extent does the timing nature of this outbreak of crisis reflect Putin's domestic considerations regarding his polling figures, the 2020 constitutional changes, and other things like that? And we can contrast that domestic situation to broader Russian international strategy. So what's going on? Is this domestic policy or is it foreign policy? And then the second question relates to a number of questions that have been asked. So I'm not going to name the people that asked them, and that relates to the impact on the Ukrainian economy specifically, but then I suppose we can have a general question. What is the broader impact of all of this on Ukraine? If this is framed as a confrontation between the West and Russia, is Ukraine being caught in the middle, and tragically so? So I'll leave those questions for the panelists.
I can start on the first question about domestic politics. I mean, of course, we always try to explain what Putin does everywhere for many years by domestic politics in Russia. But I think Russia at the moment is in such kind of situation where domestic politics pretty much disappeared in Russia. So the opposition has been crushed. There is unfortunately, no diversity of views around Putin in any shape or form. His opinion poll ratings, yes, not spectacular, definitely not anywhere near that they were after the annexation of Crimea, but they're not bad, particularly given the fact that Russia had pretty bad COVID and continues to have pretty bad COVID with excess deaths, over 1 million. And the fact that the state has paid almost nothing or very little in terms of support for people who suffered from COVID. But nonetheless, he managed effectively to kind of blame all of that on others. So I do not believe that the current escalation is driven by domestic politics in Russia. But it is definitely, in my view, driven by Putin's increasing obsession with his legacy. And as Andy explained very well with, quoting various, Putin's written word recently, for him, Ukraine has always been a very emotional issue, something that he believes he has to solve until, 2024, and something which he hopes, I think through this escalation, he will be able to solve, but without maybe necessarily doing something which can pose for him potential domestic challenge. I think a prolonged military campaign with a large number of casualties on the Russian side would certainly not be seen very positively by the Russian public opinion domestically. But if Putin secures kind of neutrality of Ukraine, I think that would be rewarded, I think, by the public opinion, because Putin's obsession with Ukraine is also translated by the obsession of Russian TV channels with Ukraine, and the public opinion is quite sensitive to that, and I think he would get a benefit if he feels that he can solve it.
Thanks, Oksana. Orysia, Andy, who wants to take?
I'll take impact on Ukraine. I mean, the impact has been very dramatic on Ukraine. And again, it's not started with just this escalation. It has started with the war in 2014, and you take human loss, you take economic cost. I mean, just the natural resources Ukraine lost in the Black Sea, access to gas. I mean, there were some calculations where the industrial part of the East and all the economy there, it cost roughly 10 billion in lost assets. So there has been already impact up to date, right, of all of this. And I think it's important to remember that this is really this war of attrition. I think Oksana is saying it too. It's here to exhaust, is to have the West give up on Ukraine and Ukraine to give up on itself, right? And this is where we are at. And that's why I think it's also full spectrum. It's from energy, it's from cyber, it's from disinformation, it's from trade embargoes. Ukrainian transit is struggling. Ukraine gets difficulty to transport its goods to China and Kazakhstan because Russia closes transit routes. It's actually this social undermining social cohesion and instability within Ukraine, always dripping this poison that Ukraine elite is completely dysfunctional. It's rather be run by Russia and it'd be so much easier for everybody. And specifically on economy, yes. I mean, I already mentioned at the beginning, it's Ukraine cannot now come back to international markets simply. It's very costly, it's impossible. That's why in addition to military assistance, Kyiv begs for economic assistance to keep up the economy. And, you know, the gas prices hiked up in Ukraine dramatically. People are not happy, believe me. Zelensky's support is dropping every day. So capitals are going out of Ukraine. So there's difficulty. But having said all of this, I mean, Ukraine has never really had social economic protest in its history, with the exception of mining protests in the 90s when they were not paid salaries, but there also was a political undertone to this. You know, in Ukraine, it's viewed as the war for independence. Russia is viewed as an aggressor state, 74% nationwide, and even 56% in the east, you know, and so southeast, where usually people, as we know, were more inclined towards relations with Russia. NATO is viewed as a threat only 12% nationwide. So you can see this. And this idea of neutrality, I think actually Putin again is doing the opposite, where Ukraine is militarizing. President Zelensky has just signed a decree 2 days ago to boost Ukrainian armed forces by 100,000, 310,000. That is a big military force. Over time, Ukraine will be quite militarized. And unlike Stalin, who respected sovereignty of Finland, he never really was saying that Finland and Russia are one people. I mean, we know that Putin doesn't respect that basic thing. So we are at this crude basic battle, unfortunately, vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia. How it will turn out, it depends again on Ukraine's perseverance and unity of the West.
Thanks, Orysia. Andy.
I think there are a whole host of reasons in both Russian domestic and foreign policy that explain why this is happening right now. The constitutional referendum and the Duma elections are out of the way, more or less successfully managed from the Kremlin's point of view. Certainly from the Kremlin's point of view, Syria is stabilized. There is disillusionment with Zelensky. They expected him to be naive and give them everything they wanted. He's become a bit more realistic in how he approaches Russia, but also his moves against Russian proxies and media within Ukraine early in 2021 explained a lot of the Russian reaction, I think. The building of the Kerch Bridge changes the strategic environment, but is kind of double-edged. It gives Russia much more possibility to pressure Ukraine, to deny passage to shipping, etc. But it also shows that not everything in Crimea is fully solved, particularly issues of water supply. That's the one thing that you can't send across a bridge. Higher oil prices make a big difference. Russia has got a lot of money in the kitty to ride out what it expects to be fairly limited sanctions. But I think a lot of it is about 2024. Just because you don't have an opposition or an effective opposition or an opposition which is allowed to take part in said election, it doesn't mean that you don't treat it as though it's a real one, because Russia normally does. You know, there's this stress on dramaturgia, you know, how you sell Putin at each presidential election. And the fact that his rating has been on the slide more or less since the last election, 2018, with the kind of Crimean consensus wearing off, rather, I think is important. A lot of this is about setup for 2024. There are other things, but yes, that's my list of domestic reasons.
And Andy, do you have a final word on what this all means for the future of Ukraine?
Economically?
Economically and in general, or in general, whichever takes your fancy. You have the final word.
Oh, do I? Excellent. Well, the one thing I would add is that, as Oksana said, in a whole series of recent crises, the West hasn't been able to intervene or exercise influence particularly effectively at all. But in this case may well be the opposite. I mean, the short-term effect of military intimidation has been a doubling of military aid from the US. The UK has sent arms. Zelensky just passed a decree to add another 100,000 to armed forces already 250,000 strong. Orysia's, as Orysia was saying, there has been a big rally around the flag effect in terms of public opinion and in terms of Western orientation, right? Which is actually good for Ukraine, scary in general, you know, because Putin doesn't want to leave with all those net losses. He, you know, that ironically increases the tension, the temptation to act militarily to reverse some of that.
Thank you for that, Andy. That brings us to the end of the session. So let me thank the panelists and Mark in absentia for some really great insights. Thanks also to the audience for joining, but also for some excellent questions. Again, apologies for the fact that we weren't able to get through all of the questions, but as I mentioned, please do get in contact with the panelists if you have a burning question. I'm sure they will respond when they can. A reminder also that the recording will be put up on the SSEES YouTube channel in the next few days. So thanks everybody again for joining and good evening.
Thanks, Ben.